Treatable. Really, it's treatable. Yes, it's treatable. It's the Treatable podcast. Say what's on your mind. It's the Treatable podcast. Real, coming, treatable. It's the Treatable podcast. It's all on the Treatable podcast.
How do you grieve when someone you love commits suicide? How should we think about the people who decide to end their own life? Are they selfish or just hurting? And what are the warning signs? How can you tell if suicide might be on someone's mind? And if it is, what do you even say? Welcome to Treatable, the podcast that explores mental health challenges with experts who show us that change is possible. I'm your host, Clint Mally, inviting you to join us as we explore different mental health challenges, learn how to navigate them, and uncover treatments that actually work. This week, we're diving into the complex topic of suicide and grieving with expert guest Lisa Sugarman. Lisa, who is an author, mental health advocate, and a 3-time survivor of suicide loss, shares her personal journey and insights on coping with the aftermath of suicide. We explore the experiences that shape her advocacy, her role as a crisis counselor with the Trevor Project, and the common misconceptions surrounding suicidal ideation. We discuss essential coping mechanisms, the importance of community and connection, and practical strategies to support those struggling with mental health issues. Lisa emphasizes the need to reframe our understanding of suicide as a mental illness rather than a moral failure. Our conversation aims to provide resources and actionable advice for listeners dealing with grief and suicidal thoughts.
Treatable podcast. It's all on the Treatable podcast.
Lisa, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
This is my pleasure, Clint. I'm just always so energized to have these conversations.
Absolutely. So let's kind of dive into the backstory of why this is an important point of conversation for you when it comes to suicide and grieving.
Sure. So like you said in the intro, I'm a 3-time survivor of suicide loss. So unfortunately, right there, those are my street credentials for being someone with an incredible amount of lived experience in this space, in that suicide space and mental health and wellness space, and in the grief and loss space. And just because I've had those 3 losses by suicide does not mean that I haven't had probably tripled the number of losses from other types of issues, like whether it be cancer or heart disease or accidents, or I've lost a lot of people in my life. And I've been really kind of accompanied by grief since I was a little girl. And I'm at the point now where I feel just so empowered to share the experiences that I've had, the things that I've done to maybe kind of cycle through my own grief. As you also said, I'm working with the Trevor Project as one of their lifeline counselors. I have been for almost 2 years. And I've acquired an awful lot of different kind of experience to help others who might be in a situation where they're feeling suicidal, they know someone who's suicidal. So that's kind of the short version of why I'm doing all the talking and writing and content creating in this space. And these are the conversations that I want to be having. So I'm grateful to be able to have it today.
For folks who don't know what the Trevor Project is, could you kind of give them a 1-minute elevator pitch, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Trevor Project is actually the country's largest LGBTQ crisis and suicide support hotline. We've got both the traditional pick up, the telephone and call a counselor. That's what I do. And then we also have a texting platform for people who just want a different option. And we've been around for over 26 years, taking calls from at-risk LGBTQ youth ages 13 to 24 who are dealing with anything that would kind of, corrupt your headspace, coming out, fears about gender identity, anything like abuse, or certainly suicidality, homicidality, homelessness, any of the things that would affect anybody's mental health. We are there to hold space for them and to try and offer support and resources the best that we can.
Absolutely. And so as somebody who's, as you've described, a 3-time survivor of suicide loss, maybe you can unpack a little bit about what that journey was like for you, right? Particularly, not speaking for everybody, but at least in your experience, and then, how that informs how you're talking to folks about suicide today.
Yeah, absolutely. So my introduction to suicide I was very young. It came at age 9 because my cousin, who was 18 at the time and lived maybe a quarter mile up the street from us, took his life. And my parents were honest about it to a point, as much as you could be honest about something like that in 1977. And they shared with me that he had been struggling emotionally and mentally. And I got it. I understood to a point. And the following year, ironically, my own father passed away. But there's a little bit of a twist to my survivor story that's a little bit unusual. So I lost my father in the summer of 1978 to what I was told was a heart attack. And I lived with that narrative for 35 years until I was 45, the same age that he was when he died. And I found out very accidentally that my dad had actually taken his life. So that's really where the big shift happened for me in my life in terms of taking what I've acquired from all these years of living with grief and loss and now suicide. It made me feel incredibly compelled to start sharing my own story of loss. And then 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, one of our best childhood friends, like in our wedding and lived together when we were all young, he very suddenly and without any warning at all took his life. So it was just a trifecta of suicide loss. And all of it just brought me to a place, you implode, or at least I did. I absolutely broke apart into a million pieces. And it was just interesting to see when I look back now and I see kind of where I've gone in the last few years, it put me back together as a completely different person, as you would expect it would, because loss changes us. And this just put me directly on a path to working with organizations like the Trevor Project and Samaritans and trying to take my own experience and make it useful for someone else. So that's what I've been doing, and that's how it brought me here.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the situation with your dad, and that's actually not a uncommon thing for the stories behind somebody's death or suicide to be hidden from the family for a variety of reasons, right? For stigma, for trying to shield them from emotional pain, and from trying to prevent them from thinking ill about something or someone who is close to them, trying not to taint their life, so to speak, right? What is it that you feel like people need to know when it comes to the basics of suicide and that people have a tendency to get wrong?
I love that question because it's so important to have this kind of specific conversation about what suicide looks like and what it actually is. It looks like almost a failure. If you're looking at it from the outside, it looks like someone failed at life. It looked like they can't handle it. It looked like they were weak. It looks like the perception is that it's this inability to survive in your life and to manage whatever is going on in your life that may not be perfect at the time, because that's, suicide is usually a direct result of some kind of depression or anxiety or stress. And so I think that's a huge misconception, that people think it's just this stigmatized, immoral and hard act that not hard, but it's something that people just want to avoid. You want to avoid labeling yourself in that capacity because that just brands you as someone who couldn't manage life. So what I think is so important is letting people understand that it's a mental illness. Like what puts someone in a position of wanting to end their life is not because they want to leave their family or they want to leave their job or their home or their community. They want to leave because they just want to get away from the pain, and they're in whatever level of pain they're in is more than they can bear. And it's not through any fault of their own. It's not through any defect of their own. It's simply because maybe in like in my father's case and in my cousin and my friend's case, there was mental illness that's attached to that pain and that suffering. And when you look at that and you understand that it's pain and suffering that's beyond that person's control, then you put it in a bucket like a cancer or a heart disease or some other illness that's beyond your control, that's incurable, that you would never think of attaching a stigma to because it's beyond the person's control. That's what I would want people to know and understand about suicide, because it's truly something that this person who's afflicted with these deep, dark, emotional issues can't avoid. They can't get themselves out of it. So I think that's the number one thing that I would want to kind of re-clarify or rebrand so that people understand it in a different way.
This episode of Treatable is brought to you by Sandstone Care, which helps teens, young adults, and their families overcome challenges with mental health, substance use, and addiction. They provide age-specific, individualized treatment plans centered around your unique situation and goals, and they only use evidence-based therapies to help you get there. They keep their group therapy sizes small so folks can connect with others going through the same struggle and so that you never feel alone. They also give academic and vocational support to help you improve your grades or to get started on your career path. And lastly, because they know that mental health and substance use affect the people closest to us, they provide support for the whole family through their family therapy program. To learn more about teen and young adult treatment options, go to sandstonecare.com. Change is possible, and Sandstone Care is here to help. Yeah, so what I heard you saying is people tend to associate suicide with failure, and they also tend to associate it with a form of selfishness. This is something that they chose to do because they didn't care about their family, they didn't care about. But what we're saying is, what I heard you say is that it's more about associating and actually connecting it with a mental illness and probably some underlying trauma that has made life painful, right? And suicide is an option for them to be able to escape that pain, to be able to, it's also a form of autonomy, isn't it? It's a form for you to be able to choose something for yourself. So much of our life, if we think about the context in which we were born, in the time period, within our genetics, our family, it's things that we don't choose. Even our sexual orientation and our gender, right? These are things that we don't choose. We come into this world, and for some of us, it is not an issue. And then for some of us, because of the result of our experiences and that context, it's really challenging. And so what you want people to walk away with, hey, if somebody commits suicide, it's not because they're selfish. It's not because they're a failure. It's because they were dealing with a mental illness and they made a choice. Is that right?
Exactly. And I was one of those people. I mean, I'll be the first one to admit, full transparency, that when I lost my cousin when I was so young, and that was my first introduction to losing a family member at all, and it certainly was my first with suicide, my instinct, not because I was taught this by anyone, but my own personal belief system developed around suicide. And it felt to me like it was an incredibly selfish thing for someone to do. And I lived with that narrative. It wasn't anything that I would walk around telling people or talking about with people, but it was just like kind of in the heart space. It felt to me like it was something that was avoidable or something that someone chose because maybe they were just, they were cowardly, and I lived with that for a really, really long time. And it was only after I found out about my own father's suicide and really just started kind of digging into the mental health behind an act like that, the motivation and the headspace behind it, that you realize, no, it's not any of those things. It's not selfish. It's not, it's not because someone's trying to escape the people in their life. It's truly and completely a disease that overtakes you and contaminates your capacity to make decisions and to think clearly, and it brings you to a place of desperation. And that's what I had to learn. That it took me a really long time, but it's funny because once I did really connect those dots, which they're not really hard dots to connect, but we all do it in our own way and at our own pace. And when I did, it was just, it blew my mind apart in a good way, because it really made me see very clearly that it's beyond someone's control.
So with these three different experiences, how was the grieving process different for each one of them? You were probably in different stages of your life, and there was probably different things going on. And can you remember how you handled things differently throughout those different stages for each one of those?
Yeah, I mean, I can try and remember back to when I was young, I mean, 9 years old. That's a really early point in someone's life to have to navigate that kind of situation. And this was someone who lived right up the street from me. We basically lived at each other's houses, and he was that much older than me that he was out of high school and had moved to the West Coast, so we were not, kind of in each other's day to day because of the age gap. So that was a hard one because, he was there and then he was gone, and there was a lot of secrecy around it. There was a lot of really trying to change that narrative that it was accidental, but anyone close to the situation understood that it was not accidental, that, in my cousin's case, he had suffered with mental illness almost his entire life. And, the way he took his life would have been very, very difficult, near impossible for it to have been an accident. So that one was just really trying to assimilate the fact that people die into my life, I think, because that was my first real experience. Moving ahead and losing my own father, I didn't know it was a suicide until I was 45 years old myself. And as I said, the way that impacted me and changed me, really the biggest piece was just coming to terms with the fact that it was not a selfish act, that he was not in his right mind, that even though he appeared to be the most loving, energetic, charismatic, under control guy that you'd ever meet, soft-spoken and just charming, and you never had any idea that he was struggling. That was, I think, with my father and my close friend who passed away, that was the thing I think that was the biggest revelation for me with the two of them, was how sneaky and hidden mental illness can be. We had absolutely no idea. You look back after the fact and you're like, oh, okay, that may have been something, or, that might have been a subtle sign, but they were so subtle that you'd have no idea. So I guess that really kind of cemented it for me, that you really just never understand what somebody's going through unless they tell you what they're going through.
And so, as somebody who's talked to tons of people who are dealing with suicidal ideation, with the Trevor Project, we know that LGBTQ folks are disproportionately challenged with mental health, usually as a result to experiencing disproportionate amounts of trauma as it relates to sexual identity. And so with that, key symptom or side effect that we've talked about is suicidal ideation. And you just mentioned that suicide often will come as a complete shock for people. It's not often that people said, well, that seemed like it was coming. It will come out of nowhere. And only in hindsight can you look back and see some of these signs. But when you're referring, or when you're talking to parents, because I know that you have written a lot with parents, what are the things that people should be looking for when it comes to suicidal ideation? How do we talk to people about this? If you feel like your friend or a family member might be struggling with depression or trauma or anxiety.
They're tricky situations. Those are hard conversations to have, and they're super situational. Like, it has to be taken into consideration who that person is to you, like how close are they to begin with, and what's the dynamic, and what's their situation, how much do you know, things like that. But I mean, I think at the end of the day, the things that are kind of universal, that run the gamut with anybody in our life who might be struggling, is just, if you're noticing differences in that person, in their behaviors, in their communication, or maybe lack of communication when there was a lot, or they were someone that you tended to socialize a lot with, even kids. This applies to children and teens just as much. If their behaviors start to really change dramatically, and they start to withdraw, or in some people's cases, they may start to give away things that were important to them, or it might be even easier to pinpoint, because they might start speaking about their life being unlivable, or they're not worthy, or they have nothing to live for, or there are things that are more or less obvious depending on the situation. But I'd say the biggest things are really just kind of keeping your eyes open for obvious differences in someone's demeanor and their day to day, because those are pretty telltale signals that something's off, something's not right. And it might not necessarily be that that person is suicidal and contemplating hurting themselves or someone else, or has already started that, but it definitely could mean that they're feeling low or they're feeling depressed and that they need help. So the best thing you can do is just be very direct and just ask. I mean, you think that someone's, running the risk of harming themselves? Absolutely ask them directly. Are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about harming yourself? Otherwise, if you're not that concerned about that risk, I would just say, what's really going on? What's happening in your life right now? You don't seem like yourself. Do you want to talk? Can I hold some space for you? Those are definitely ways that you can approach it.
And can you kind of talk about the difference in thinking about death and thinking about suicide? Because there is a key difference, right? So oftentimes we think about death, we think about what would life be like if I wasn't here, right? That is a common thing that most humans at some point in their life go through. It's that age-old expression of memento mori. Remember, you will die. That is a common thing. I think it is a unique thing about humans to think about the fact that we're not going to be walking around on this earth forever. And that's actually a healthy thing. It impacts the way that you talk to folks. It impacts the way that you do things. It helps you prioritize things and think about your life and put things into perspective. And there's a difference between that and suicidal ideation, right? Maybe you can help me unpack the differences between those.
Yeah, that's interesting. No one's ever really gone to that place with a podcast question, and I really appreciate that, because there is an important distinction to be made. I mean, like you said, at some point or another, we all become very aware of our own mortality and the mortality of the people that we love and we care about. And we do that maybe because we've had experiences losing people, or we're fearful of losing people, kids with their parents, people with their grandparents. So that's normal. You're right, 100%. But then you cross over into this place of suicidal ideation. And that's a very different place. That's a place where you're spending your time not kind of contemplating, what would it be like to not be here, but you don't want to be here. You're thinking about suicide as kind of an exit strategy. You're overwhelmed. There's that difference. There's a difference between being curious about the fact that, we all die and where do we go, and kind of those afterlife philosophical questions. And then we jump over to the other side where, when you're having suicidal ideation, you are thinking about how you are going to take your own life. And you're generally doing that because you are depressed, or you are facing some kind of a mental health challenge. And you're thinking about what means you're going to use. And you're maybe even taking it a step further, and you're researching ways to take your life or to harm yourself. So it puts it in a completely different bucket when you talk about ideation, because now someone's formulating a plan, and maybe they're thinking, I want to do this thing to myself this way on this day in this place. And so when someone is thinking in those terms, that's suicidal ideation.
The key things that I'm hearing you say is it's a plan. It's actually thinking about the who, what, where, when, how, right? Another key thing I heard you say is that it's about the language that we use when we talk about it. I am going to do this. I'm thinking about doing this. I'm planning on doing this. And you can only really understand suicidal ideation through specific words and specific actions. Am I writing a letter, right? Am I talking about my life in the past tense, right? Another one that often is overlooked is, does this person have a new sense of calm? If somebody is really depressed and upset, and suddenly they seem extremely calm and relaxed and chill, sometimes that can be a result of this person making up in their mind that they are going to do this thing, they are going to commit suicide. And the thought of that allows them to have some sort of peace because they now can see a finish line for their pain, for their struggle. Some of the other signs I just wanted to point out, you talked about notice the changes in the person, and the key word here is changes. And what are some of those changes? They could be things like you're noticing a decrease, and these are really for mental health challenges, but because mental health challenges and suicidal ideation are often connected, it's important to be able to talk about their similarities, right? So if you've noticed a decrease in their performance at school or at work, that's a change. If you've noticed a sudden isolation with them, that they used to hang out with folks and now they're spending time by themselves, that's a change. If you've noticed a change in friend group, sometimes that change also is really important. If you've noticed loud or even distinct mood changes that are completely different from the way that they would normally act, that is a change. If you've seen an increased amount in substance use within them, whether it's, alcohol or marijuana or whatever, opioids, it doesn't matter, an increase in substance use, that's a big change. All of these changes, when they start adding up, usually two or more of those can be, or even one of them, honestly, can be a big sign that somebody might be struggling with their mental health and then turn to suicide as a way out. Not saying that everyone who has a mental health challenge has suicidal ideation, but it's usually a predecessor. And you touched on one thing earlier that I just wanted to talk about when it came to self-harm. And I was wondering if you could unpack the differences between self-harm and planning suicide, because they're pretty different, right?
They are, and they can be mutually exclusive. So planning a suicide is, I think, pretty self-explanatory. You're planning the end of your own life. You're orchestrating the means that you're going to use, maybe the timeline, and maybe the place. And the ultimate goal there is to end your own life. But with self-harming, there are a lot of people out there who are self-harming in both visible and invisible ways that are, they are for sure a cry for help. They are for sure distressing signs when you see that someone is in that place of self-harming. But the intention behind it isn't necessarily to end their own life. They may be in an incredible amount of emotional pain, and they're kind of projecting it through physical pain. Maybe they're cutting, maybe that they're hitting themselves. There's so many different ways that someone can self-harm. Unfortunately, get very creative in doing that, but it isn't necessarily with the means to an end. It's not as a way of taking their own life. It's just a way that they're expressing the pain that they're in on the inside.
Yeah, in a way, it's actually a way to deal with their life, right? So it could be cutting, and cutting is often the one that is usually the most connected with suicidal ideation, because sometimes people will cut themselves to kill themselves, but the cutting is also going to be very different. Oftentimes you're cutting in places that are going to be non-lethal in a way that is non-lethal. And the pain allows you to be able to tap into something other than the pain that you're feeling emotionally. So the physical pain helps to redirect you. Some of the other things could be picking. This is often picking at wounds. Sometimes it's through burning, right? Where it comes to burning places, often places that people don't see, like the inside of the thighs or things like that. And all of those things are actually what therapists and counselors call a maladaptive coping mechanism, which is really just a fancy way of saying that it's a way that you deal with pain in a way that actually doesn't help address the pain. It just subsides in, right? The challenge and the problem with a lot of these is, one, they have physical lasting marks. Two, they can become more progressive. And so that it takes more and more of these things to be able to have the same amount of effect, just like actually any other type of addiction in that way. Even though you know it's harming you, you now can't stop. And the last thing is that even though it is not a sign that somebody has a suicidal ideation, it can be a predecessor for harming yourself, right? So if you've cut yourself horizontally across the wrist or the inner thighs or whatever, then you think about, now what would it be like to cut myself vertically? Is there anything you would add to that?
No, I don't think I would. I mean, I think we've covered kind of the the foundational aspects of it. What I will say is that in terms of being a crisis counselor and talking to folks all the time who are self-harming, one of the things that is our goal as counselors isn't to solve your problems, even though we wish we could, and it isn't to stop you from the behaviors like a cutting or like overindulging in substances and things like that. It's never to stop you from doing all of those things. It's to help you reduce the intensity or the frequency that you are doing those things so that they aren't lethal. They don't become lethal. We want you to go the other way and reduce the behaviors with the ultimate goal of at some point being able to get them under control and stop them. So, I mean, if someone is self-harming, that's always our goal, is to get them to self-harm less, cut less.
How do you go about doing that?
There are a lot of different ways. I mean, just in terms of like cutting, the first thing that comes to mind is you can encourage the person who is doing the cutting, for instance, to put a rubber band around your wrist and take the rubber band and flick it against your skin, which is going to hurt. It might feel, like a bee sting, or it might, feel like a sharp pain instantaneously, but then it's not going to harm you. You know what I'm saying? It's not going to leave a lasting scar necessarily. It's the pain threshold isn't going to be the same as it would if you were cutting yourself repeatedly. So that's a good example. If someone is doing an awful lot of abusing of substances, whether it be, like you said, marijuana or pills or alcohol, we're asking them to do those things on a lesser scale. If you want to drink to black out, maybe, try and have a drink or have 2 drinks and then somehow remove yourself from, a place of access to those things. So that the goal is always to minimize those behaviors in a way of kind of ultimately being able to get them under control so they don't exist.
Something that this made me think of, that I'm not sure I had thought about this in this perspective before, is that self-harming behaviors are a way to reorient you back to your physical body, in a way to kind of interrupt you from the cycles and repetitions that come in your mental or your emotional state. So oftentimes, if I'm dealing with a challenging thought, I'm dealing with a challenging emotion, and I'm in that rumination period that's cycling, and I'm in a cyclone, it just keeps going around in circles and does not stop. One of the only ways that your body has naturally figured out to be able to exit this cycle is to tap into where you are in your body here and now, to be able to say, oh, I'm a human being, and there is wind blowing outside and the sun is on my face, and I can curl my toes on the carpet, and I can hear my dog sleeping next to me. When I do that, it helps me to snap out of my emotions and my thoughts. Those cutting behaviors, those self-harming behaviors, are really like how any type of coping mechanism that we choose, it's a form of control, right? It's helping us to be able to control our state. And all of us as humans want to feel in control. So whether it's a positive one, meaning that it's something that has a low amount of harm to myself long-term, or if it's a very harmful thing where it comes to cutting or something, we have to remember that this is actually somebody's attempt to try and control themselves and to actually feel better. And the commonality between all of these things is it's just a different way to deal with things. And as humans, that's not something that they teach us in school oftentimes. If you think about it, when you're struggling, when you're and having bad behavior. I know as a former teacher, a key thing is you go and you isolate yourself. You go and you put yourself in a space away from people, away from community, and what do? You think about your situation, you cycle in your thoughts, you ruminate, right? Until you're bored to death. And then you come back into the group. And what does that teach us? It teaches us that our emotions and our thoughts, if we're having these things and they manifest in negative behaviors, I need to hide them, because if I show them, then I'm not worthy of being in the community. And so all that to say, this is like a great monologue for just trying to like explain the fact that these coping mechanisms, whether they're cutting or they're more positive, are just ways to reorient ourselves back into our bodies so that we can feel human again and not be stuck in the cycle of negative thoughts and emotions. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It all makes perfect sense. And it's so important to talk about that aspect of mental health and wellness, because there's so much that we can't control. And there is a part of it all that we can control. And those are some of the ways that we can control. And while you were talking about ways to kind of ground yourself, it made me think of a technique. One of the techniques that we offer when we're counseling is called the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique. And, most people in the mental health community have heard of this. And it's, like you find 5 things in that moment of extreme stress to kind of de-escalate yourself. When you don't have anybody else there to help you, you think of, 5 things that you can see, and then 4 things that you can touch, and 3 things you can hear, and 2 that you can taste and smell, and so on. And it grounds you into the present moment. And it isn't necessarily walking through sand or, tall grass. It's a little bit different, but it works on the same principle of kind of reorienting ourselves back to where we are, and remembering that we're here in the present. So yeah, these are totally valid things to be talking about, and important. And they're strategies. These are things that we can always have in our back pocket, just like having the 988 suicide and crisis support hotline number, kind of on our brains. These are the things that we all need to be talking about, so that we all remember that they're out there.
Yeah. So these coping skills, these ways to ground ourselves, oftentimes you'll hear these as mindfulness techniques. When we think about people getting support, we often think about talking about our feelings and talking about our traumas or whatever. But the important thing to remember is that you can't actually unpack any of the emotional baggage or trauma or stuff that you're feeling if you don't first have, 1, a sense of safety, and 2, if you can't feel oriented in the space that you're in, right? So if anybody's watching or listening and they're interested in more of these types of mindfulness activities, I'll say that this is actually a key component of dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. And one of the things that they teach you within DBT is the TIP skills. And TIP stands for temperature, meaning that you do something to change your temperature, whether it's holding your breath and putting your face in some cold water, or splashing cold water, or something like that. The I of TIP stands for intense exercise. So anything that can be vigorous, that's, whether it's jumping or lifting weights or playing basketball or running, any type of way you can move your body in an intense way for a while can be extremely helpful. There's 2 P's in TIP. The first P stands for paced breathing deeply in your belly, slowing your pace of your breathing, or even just trying to maintain a consistent pace of your breathing, right? So box breathing is 4 seconds in, holding it, 4 seconds out, holding it, and then coming back, exhaling for 4 seconds and coming back to baseline. And then the last one is paired muscle relaxation. And this is where you can like squeeze your hand really tight and then let go, or you can curl your toes really tight and then let go. And you would often use a keyword like relax or calm in combination with the releasing of those things. So if you're listening to this and you're saying, oh, that's me, I'm spiraling in a mental health challenge, I'm using a negative coping strategy, I want to learn more actual ways to calm myself and to orient myself back in my body, those can be some great places to start. Is there any other ones that come off the top of your mind or that you want people to know about, Lisa?
I would say you mentioned part of it with that vigorous exercise. I would say movement. I would say being outdoors. I know for myself, and certainly for so many of the people who I talk to day to day who are on lifelines, and we talk about what do they do when they get into a negative headspace. And inevitably people say they'll either meditate, which is a way of centering yourself and grounding yourself and regulating your heartbeat and your breath work, or going out and just being in nature. And that doesn't necessarily mean, going for a 10-mile run or doing something even super vigorous. It may just mean getting outside, getting in the sunshine, feeling the air on your face, being connected with the world. And then journaling, I think, is a beautiful way of kind of taking what's going on the inside and putting it in a place, kind of offloading it. If maybe you don't have someone to go to listen and hold space for you, maybe it's just you and a notebook, and the way to kind of process through those thoughts or maybe offload those thoughts is to write them down. And that's not only helpful to kind of clear our head, but it's also helpful because in doing that, it also helps us to process what's going on and think about things from a different perspective. So all of those things are helpful and valuable. And I actually had done a lot of work on my own website recently as a part of this bigger overarching mental health resources hub that I have on my website with all the, the names and links to all the bigger mental health organizations and hotlines. I also have what I'm calling a toolkit hub with tools, exactly like you're talking about, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding techniques and mindfulness techniques and how to navigate something like a grief attack when it comes on, what to do. So you can always find any of those downloadable infographics and sheets on my website as well, and links to other mental health orgs that provide similar tools.
And listeners and watchers, you will find that linked up in the show notes of the description box for this video or podcast, wherever you are listening or watching. I wanted to follow up on two things. I want to talk about grief, and I want to talk about grief attacks, as you mentioned just earlier. But another thing that you just said was about connecting with the world. And we've noticed, maybe you can just share with your experience in dealing with folks who have suicidal ideation. What is their connection like with the people around them? Is connection a big predictor when it comes to suicidal ideation or thinking about suicide? They feel like they're disconnected from others, or do people have really positive relationships in their life and they still commit suicide? What do we need to know about that?
I think it goes either way. To be honest with you, again, goes right back to situational. It depends on who you are and what you're struggling with. And there can be people who are out there feeling like they themselves are not worthy of relationships. So they're not pursuing relationships. They don't have a really rich, deep, wide community. So they retreat and they're in their own heads most of the time, and maybe they're isolated. And then there can be those who are struggling, who do reach out for help, but they're not okay in their own mind and in their own hearts, and they can't form a healthy relationship with the people who are in their life, maybe because they feel like they're in a different place. They feel like maybe they're in some cases further behind in life, not where they should be. I think people are always measuring themselves against the people in the community around them. And that can be a good thing as far as inspiration is concerned, but it can also be a really negative and toxic trait when you start comparing yourself to, well, why am I not married yet? Why don't I have my own house? Why don't I have my own kids? Why, all the things that are around you that you choose to see that make you feel worse about yourself. So I think, it can go either way, but I think the bottom line with community and mental illness or mental wellness even is we're not alone. We're not designed to be alone. We're creatures who are designed to be together, to work together, to thrive and coexist together. And so our best chance at leveraging whatever community we have around us is by being vulnerable within that community and being honest and open. And if you're not okay, don't be afraid to say, I'm not okay, and here's why, because your community is useless to you if they don't really know what's going on the inside.
Let's transition, because I know I have one person in mind who I love, who experienced a suicide in their family not too long ago. And I'm thinking about, I want this episode to be really actionable and helpful for somebody like yourself who's experienced a lot of suicide in their life. And as somebody who's had that in their own life, how does somebody go about grieving suicide and making sure that they don't have this event be something that spirals them into a mental health challenge?
That's a really tricky one, because there are so many, I guess, nuances to suicide loss that don't exist with other types of loss. You know, when you think about someone dying of cancer, or someone, you know, God forbid, getting hit by a bus, or, you know, something, or drowning or accidentally. I mean, things like that are horrible and they're sad, and we grieve the loss of those people, but we're not walking around asking questions about it, having thoughts that, you know, we could have done more to prevent it, or should have done more, or should have said more, or should have looked closer. Those pieces don't exist, but they do exist with suicide loss. And that's why survivors of suicide loss, like me and so many millions of others, struggle so often. It's not a linear trip. Grief, I don't care what the cause of someone's death is, whether it's suicide or not, grief never ends. You know, even if you're losing someone who, let's say, is a grandparent who has lived a beautiful, long life, they're 100 years old and they've got 1 million grandchildren, it doesn't make that loss any less significant. It's a loss, and it stays with you, and it defines parts of your life. And, you know, I think the way for me, because I've had so much loss, the way that I move through my life is to allow grief to live right alongside me. It has to. It's always there. You know, you can't have a parent, you can't lose a parent and have lived with that parent in your life for however long they were there, and not be reminded of that person, or a sibling, or a relative, or a friend. You're always reminded of that person. Things are always triggering you. And for me, it's when I learned to just sit in it. I guess there's no other, I'm oversimplifying it for sure, but it's the truth. You just sit in those feelings. If you're sad, if you're missing them. And this goes to, you know, to your point about grief attacks, why, you know, kind of how do you navigate something like that when an attack of grief hits you so hard that it can be so debilitating? Let it come. Let it come through you. If you're crying, cry. If you're angry, you know, hit the pillow, stomp on the ground, go for an angry run, whatever you have to do. But it's understanding that we have to learn to coexist with grief, and we can, because grief and loss and sadness and joy and love and happiness can all coexist. We just have to give them their own unique space.
Yeah. So summarizing some of the thoughts that I heard you saying is, one is that grief has no time limit. Do not say, I need to grieve for 3 months and then get back to business, and then be distraught when 2 years later you have a wave of grief hit you and it feels like it was just yesterday, right? There is no time limit. You can grieve for your entire life, and that doesn't make you a bad person or a weak person. That makes you a human being, a human person. And it's a normal part. The next thing I would say, based on what you said, is connecting with others and not keeping it inside. So you talked about grandparents and how somebody can live a long, healthy life and die of natural causes in old age, and you still grieve that person. And I get that, because, you know, I had a grandparent, lived a long life, said he was ready to go. He died. And I still have dreams where I'm talking to him and crying and connecting and all of those things. I have no words that I wish I would have said to him when we were living. It is a natural human part. It is a way for our brain to remember these relationships and to hold them close. All these cultures, all these humans have that. But then the other part of it is when it's something connected with suicide, you have to feel those feelings. As you said, you have to sit in those feelings. I had a brother who died of an overdose. And when that happened, similar to my grandparents, where I have dreams where I'm having conversations with them, I have them all the time where I'm talking to him and I'm like, how is this possible? You're dead. But the point of all of that is that those are two very different circumstances. Both are death, and both of those feelings need to be felt. And I'm lucky enough to have a partner who, anytime I'm feeling these things, what's always been very helpful for me is to just talk about it. I'm feeling sad because I'm thinking about him. And I know that he's dead, and I know that it's been a long time, and it still hits me. And this person doesn't have to try and solve all your problems. They don't have to change your patterns of thinking. They just have to be able to hold space for you and allow you to feel those feelings. And I'm imagining a lot of what you're doing within the Trevor Project, and even in these crisis situations where everything feels very urgent, is just holding space for this person to feel connected and understood. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That is the majority of what we do. Because remember, in the role that I'm in as a volunteer, I'm a crisis counselor. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a therapist. I'm not trained to be. So I'm not trained to give someone advice per se, in the way that you get advice if you went in to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. What I'm trained to do is to hold that space for someone who just needs to vent or to talk, or they're frightened, or they need resources. And if I have the capacity to help them find resources that they need, or develop a safety plan, for instance, or come up with coping mechanisms to help them de-escalate some behaviors, those are the things that I'm trained to do. But 90% of what I do is just really try to create a rapport with the person who I'm talking to, and I'm actively listening, and I'm helping this person work through the place that they're in right now. I'm not trying to solve it. I mean, as much as we would all love to be able to solve each other's problems, that's not the design. It's to allow that person to have a free, unbiased, no prejudice place to put their feelings. And there's no expectation there except that someone's going to listen to you.
Your feelings have to be felt. If we think about the majority of mental health challenges, if we think about addiction, is when we experience something in our life that is painful and traumatic and challenging and calls into question who we are and what we think about ourselves. And if we don't have a way to be able to connect and to share those thoughts and those feelings with others, and we hold it inside, it manifests itself in a variety of different ways. And sometimes it's depression, sometimes it's OCD, sometimes it's anxiety and fear. But overall, it's going to be about trying to have that feeling come out one way or another, right? Lisa, this has been an extremely beautiful and I think engaging conversation. And I'm sure our listeners, watchers want to know, where can they go to learn more about you and all the incredible stuff that you're writing and work that you're doing?
The best place to find me, to reach out to me, to find any of the work that I do is just on my website. It's lisasugarman.com. It's where I've got my YouTube channel pumping into my website. My Suicide Survivor series videos drop every week on Mondays. And they're just short little, very, very little 90 seconds or less vignettes about just my own experience of whether it be grief or loss or mental health challenges. Those are on my website. All the books I've written, all the content that I've created is there. And this mental health resources hub that I mentioned earlier is also there as well. So I'm on all the socials. I'm on, Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and all the socials, but the best place is my website.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa, so much for joining us on the podcast. Listen, y'all, this suicide thing, the grief that comes along with it, it is real, but it is also more common than you think. And most of all, it's treatable. We will see you on the next episode. This episode of Treatable was edited by Daniel Lopez. The intro and explanatory sections of the episode were written by Alexandra Kruger. The theme song was created by Sebastian Gonzalez, and the cover art for this episode is created by Joel Daniel. If you got any value from this episode, it would personally mean the world to me if you would leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. It helps to spread mental health awareness to more folks, and I read each and every comment that people leave. So tell us what you appreciate about the podcast, and you just might hear us feature it on the next episode. All of my love, and we'll see you on the next one.